Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. I'm delighted to be joined today by Father Innocent Smith, a Dominican friar who is an assistant professor of dogmatic theology and pastoral studies at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. We discuss the poetic style of St. Thomas Aquinas, compare that to his purely theological writings, and touch on the circumstances that led to his composition of a body of liturgical texts for the Feast of Corpus Christi. Before we get into the interview, I want to invite you to apply for the Choral Institute this summer, July 7th through the 11th, one of our 9 graduate courses here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. Each day of the week in the Choral Institute, we sing lauds, mass, and vespers in Gregorian chant alongside 2 polyphonic motets per day, 3 Gregorian ordinaries, and 2 polyphonic ordinaries throughout the week, as well as some hymns. These immersive experiences are buttressed by rehearsals to prepare the music, as well as sessions in which you learn how to run a really great rehearsal, teach group vocal technique, and develop your singer's musicianship and sight reading. There are plenty of opportunities for fellowship and fun on our beautiful campus of St. Patrick's Seminary here in Menlo Park, California. And we also spend some time during the week workshopping the compositions of the 5 composers competitively selected to study that week with Dr. Frank LaRocca in the composition seminar. 2 audition recordings, both short, one of your line in Sicut Cervus and the other of the introit Salve Sancta Parens, are required to audition to get into the class. If you're looking for an amazing opportunity to immerse yourself in the Church's sacred music and liturgy, we encourage you to apply. More information is available at catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. Click on Summer Classes. And now, on to the interview. Father, it's been a while since I've had you on the show, but I'm very happy that you have accepted my invitation to come back. So thanks for being here.
Great to be with you today.
Can you describe Aquinas' formative years as a young person and what his experience of the sacred liturgy would have been like before we head into this discussion about Aquinas' poetry, and especially his poetry that he wrote for the sacred liturgy? But I'm just trying to get at the kind of background that he would have had to enter into religious life, the liturgy, and artistic creation.
Thomas grew up in southern Italy. He was born near the town of Aquino, but quite close to the monastery of Monte Cassino. And as a young boy, he actually was sent to the monastery. So he was what was called an oblate as a child. So he, from a very young age, from about 5 years old or so, would have been living the rhythms of the liturgy to some extent in that Benedictine monastic context. So Thomas would have become very familiar with the Psalms, with the antiphons, the hymns of the office, the chants of the Mass. We don't know too many details about exactly what it was like to be an oblate at that time in the early 13th century, but it would have certainly been a strong exposure to the liturgy. But then as a young man, Thomas began to study philosophy in Naples, and there he encountered the newly founded Dominican order, the Order of Preachers. And so he quickly decided that he wanted to join that order. So when he joined the Dominicans, he would have switched his kind of way of praying in some substantial ways. So the Benedictines follow the monastic cursus of the hours, whereas the Dominicans followed the secular cursus, a different number of psalms per hour, a whole different arrangement of the office. The Mass liturgy would have been relatively similar between the Dominicans and Benedictines, but perhaps the musical styles, the style of liturgical vestments, of liturgical processions would have been quite different as well. So as a young friar, Thomas would have continued to be rooted in some of those traditions he had been formed in as a boy, but would have also gone deeper into praying the liturgy in a new way as a Dominican.
Could you talk a little bit about Aquinas' life at different points in his life and different locations? And, was that accompanied by a development or changes in the typical horarium for someone in the Order of Preachers?
So Thomas's first year in the order was quite unusual. After receiving the habit, he was kidnapped by his family. So he spent a full year at his parents' house, where he was kind of kept hostage, as it were. So during that year, Thomas actually had a breviary with him, a Dominican breviary, and I think that's a very significant moment in his formation. That he spent that year, as it were, learning the rhythms in a more private but still ecclesial way. So Thomas's horarium would have been quite flexible during that first year, I should think. Apparently, he was able to be visited by a Dominican friar who lived nearby once a week or so. So he wasn't entirely alone, but that would have been a quite unusual year. But then after that, he was essentially sent from house to house for the rest of his life. He was never in any place more than about 3 years or so. His first studies seem to have been either in Paris or Cologne. So he spent some years studying in those two cities. He eventually became a professor in Paris. So these were some of the major houses of the order at the time, Paris in particular. And we don't know too many details on exactly how the horarium worked at that time. He would have prayed the different hours of the office, but we don't know exactly what time of day those took place at. Things of that nature were probably somewhat specified by the local conditions of, the when sunrise was, the different locations of Europe that he was living in. France and Italy would have had slightly different kind of time frames, as it were, throughout the year. But basically, Thomas's experience would have been to pray the office with the brothers, to celebrate Mass before his ordination, to participate in the community Mass, to eventually start celebrating his own private Masses in addition to community Masses and so forth. So for Dominicans, one of the most important hours was actually Compline. That was considered a mandatory hour for all of the friars. Friars like Thomas may have been permitted to skip the office from time to time, to not participate communally, but they still would have been expected to do a private recitation if they were too occupied with their studies. So Thomas's experience of the liturgy was probably fairly flexible at different stages throughout his life.
And do you know much about the chant style in those formative years of the Order of Preachers? Was it already taking that sort of style from the Cistercians with truncation of melismas and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so Thomas entered the order around 1244, and during those years, the order was beginning to reform its liturgy. It already had a something of a unified liturgy, but it was all a work in progress. So when Thomas first entered, there was already a distinctive melodic tradition for Dominicans, and it was influenced to some degree by the Cistercians already. But then, about 10 years into Thomas's time in the order, in the 1250s, Humbert of Romans reformed the Dominican liturgy to be more markedly succinct and brief. So Thomas would have had actually different experiences of the liturgy at his early stage of entry and after some years in the order. So the melodic tradition was, and the rhythmic tradition of the order was, as it were, being worked out during his time in the order.
Mm-hmm. I also think, imaginatively, to be sure, of his time at the University of Paris as a professor, and think about the building of the cathedral and the music of the Magnus Liber Organi. Would he have had an opportunity to experience that music that was really from the secular canons?
Yeah, I would say for sure. So Thomas would have. We know that he was at at Notre Dame de Paris on various occasions for special academic events, and it's not at all unbelievable that he would have been able to experience some of the liturgies there. The Dominicans and the Franciscans and the other groups of students and professors at Paris had different churches they would celebrate at, but they seem to have occasionally gone from church to church for special liturgies. So I don't think it's at all impossible that Thomas would have known that polyphonic tradition.
Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit and now talk about his poetic imagination and formation. And would he have had a sort of education in poetics? And I ask this especially because, many describe the precision with which he spoke in theological treatises as manifesting a sort of dry use of language and almost like an anti-poetical impetus.
Yeah, so Thomas probably would have read poetry as part of his early education at Monte Cassino. There was a great cultivation of the classics there. And again, we don't know all too many details about exactly what the curriculum would have been, but he surely had some exposure to the Latin poetic tradition. One of his brothers seems to have been a vernacular poet as well. We don't know for sure whether Thomas also wrote poetry in the vernacular in Italian, but certainly Thomas was in a milieu in which poetry was present. I think that when people speak about his prose style as being unpoetic, I think they're often making a kind of category error. They're expecting a kind of literary quality in a work that is meant to be more schematic. So Thomas's theological treatises are really technical works. And when you read a technical work, you don't necessarily look for kind of the most elusive poetic beauty. That can, in a way, sometimes get in the way of clarity. But that doesn't mean that Thomas couldn't be poetic or couldn't be imaginative when he wanted to. So, I mean, it's interesting throughout the Summa, he quotes various church fathers, he quotes poetry at various moments, he quotes liturgical texts. He's clearly thinking in a more expansive way. But I think we can see the kind of beauty of his clear prose. I might be going out on a limb in claiming that it's beautiful, but I think there's a kind of beauty in the claritas that comes in Thomas's work. I think you can also see a poetic beauty in just the arrangement of his work overall. So one of the great art historians of the 20th century, Panofsky, would compare scholastic theology to Gothic architecture. So this sense of the careful arrangement of different parts as making a kind of greater beauty. So I think Thomas clearly had this ability to order things rightly or wisely in his mind and try to express them clearly. So I think if we look at his prose and want something other than what he's given us, I think we're making a mistake. But obviously, if we look at his poetic works, we see him expressing himself in a totally different mode. So I think it's a matter of just trying to take what he's given us on its own terms rather than imposing our own expectations on it.
Go to the summit. Join us this summer, July 1st through the 4th, 2025, at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, for the Fons et Coulmen Sacred Liturgy Summit. The summit gathers Catholics who love Christ, the Church, and the Church's sacred liturgical tradition for the solemn celebration of the Mass and Vespers, insightful talks on the sacred liturgy, liturgical formation, and the sacred liturgical arts, and fellowship to build fraternal bonds through which the clergy, religious, and lay faithful can support the Church and one another in their promotion of the sacred liturgy. Speakers and celebrants include Cardinals Sarah, Ranjith, and O'Malley, as well as Archbishop Cordileone, Abbot Benedict from the monks in Norcia, and many others. You'll have a chance not only to assist at the sacred liturgy and hear wonderful speakers, but designed to foster conversation amongst attendees and speakers, the summit's schedule features time for shared meals and conversational fora. The fora, moderated by conference hosts, will engage participants, prelates, and clergy in attendance, and summit speakers in discussion about the practicalities of the promotion of the sacred liturgy and liturgical formation in their parishes and schools. Music for the liturgy will be provided by the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, featuring an all-professional choir from around the country, directed by Professor Christopher Berry and me, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka, the director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, and with the assistance of organist Dr. Aaron James. Affordable housing in the area is available, and the conference registration fee includes many meals. More information is available at liturgysummit.org. Don't miss out on this amazing opportunity to be inspired and empowered to promote beautiful sacred liturgy in your area. The summit awaits you. liturgysummit.org. So do you think that Aquinas would say that clarity is the only thing that's valuable when we read texts, or are there other values that a human person can take away from different styles of writing, perhaps?
I mean, one example would be Thomas's treatment of the usefulness of the imagery or metaphors that appear in Scripture. So, Scripture speaks to us in different ways in different sections. Some parts are very clear and straightforward, telling us what to do, telling us what's happened. Other parts are much more poetic and elusive, and get us to kind of meditate and force us to think more carefully about what God is trying to say to us. So in the opening question of the Summa, for instance, Thomas affirms the value of metaphor in Scripture, and it essentially is a way of helping us to think through in a more vivid way truths. So the same abstract truth can be expressed in a very clear way or in a more poetic, kind of fulsome way. And I think that the use of human imagery to talk about God, for instance, of course, God doesn't have a body in himself. God doesn't get angry. God doesn't do all these things that Scripture says of him. But these scriptural metaphors help us to understand more deeply on our own way of thinking who God is, who transcends all that we can really say about him.
So there's a particular way in which metaphor corresponds to the fact that we have bodies.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, I think we know by means of material things, and we often use images to get across even abstract ideas. So I think poetry often uses external imagery in order to get us to some deeper truth. But it's not poetry. One of the things about it is it's not just a matter of kind of decoding it. So poetry isn't just a syllogism in a different form. It is a different mode of communicating, but it's ultimately complementary as an expression of truth and beauty.
Right. So what were the first poetic texts that Aquinas composed?
Well, the earliest ones that we have any confidence about him having written would really be the liturgical chants for Corpus Christi. So those he was seems to have been asked to write around 1264. So that's more or less in the midpoint of his academic career. He wrote for about 20 years straight, and so the poetry comes, as it were, between him finishing, as it were, his doctoral studies, his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, and his famous Summa Theologiae. So he was asked to write the liturgy for Corpus Christi, and it was really a transformative moment for him in trying to articulate theological ideas and the mystery of the Eucharist in a poetic mode.
And can you tell us a little bit about the backstory of Corpus Christi as a feast that would have led up to the commissioning of Aquinas to write these texts?
In the early 13th century, there was a young woman named Juliana of Liège, or Juliana Cornillon. She grew up in Liège, and she started having visions of a moon with something missing from it, like a little sliver that was missing from the moon. Juliana was very devout. She was a great participator in the liturgy of her time and place, and she gradually came to understand that this vision was really an invitation from Christ to institute a new feast that would help people to grow in their devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. So Juliana started working in Liège to institute the Feast of Corpus Christi. So this would have, she started doing this more and more publicly in the 1230s, and then into the 1240s, she got the approval of various theologians of the time, including Hugh of St. Cher, who was one of the great Dominican theologians of the 13th century and also a friend and teacher, perhaps, of Aquinas. So Juliana got the approval of Hugh of St. Cher, and she also got the approval of a local archdeacon called Jacques Pantaleon. So the two of them were great advocates of what Juliana was trying to do, and they helped her to implement the feast in various places.
Can I
But
interject a question there? I mean, was she just a laywoman or was she religious?
so Juliana was, it's hard to exactly categorize her. So she's really lived out different modes of life at different stages. For a while, she was raised within a community of essentially secular sisters, Beguines, we might call them, but they were taking care of a leper colony outside of Liège. So she was raised there as an orphan, actually. And then later on, she somewhat became a sister. She was trying for a while to get the sisters in her community to follow the rule of St. Augustine, but this was very controversial and problematic. So it's hard to say exactly, was she a sister? Was she a laywoman? She seems to have had kind of different categories at different stages, and she ended her life as a wanderer, actually. She was exiled from Liège, and she spent time living near Cistercian monasteries. So she really lived a number of different modes of life throughout her earthly journey.
Right. So that is interesting, given the fact that you were just narrating this kind of path of the evolution of the feast. And I'd like to have you continue on that narration there. But I mean, just that she had seemingly an entree to speaking to very powerful people in the church, to going to an exiled life. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the 13th century was a tumultuous time, just like our own. And so, as different secular rulers and different bishops came in and out of Liège, sometimes Juliana, she seems to have come from a wealthy family. Sometimes she was in a position where she could, was on good terms with the local bishop. At one point, a new bishop came in who didn't support her and her community. So she essentially went into a self-imposed exile, but was supported by a local Cistercian abbess. So yeah, Juliana's life was very complex. And one of the beautiful mysteries of it was that she didn't actually get to see the success of her work for the Feast of Corpus Christi. So it essentially began to be celebrated after she left Liège in a more serious way. And then she died in the year 1258. And shortly afterwards, her old friend Jacques Pantaleon was elected the Pope. So he became Pope Urban IV. And so Urban called his previous friend from Liège, Hugh of Saint Cher, to serve at the papal curia in Orvieto. So these two, who had known Juliana, who had worked to spread the feast, were now together, sort of running the church, as it were, at Orvieto with the mobile Roman Curia. And just by happy providence, Thomas Aquinas had been assigned by his superiors to serve in Orvieto, to serve as the lector of the local Dominican community. So all three of these men, Jacques Pantaleon, who is Urban, Hugh of St. Cher, and Thomas Aquinas, they're all in Orvieto in the 1260s. And we don't have very many documents about exactly what's going on at this time, and we shouldn't expect them really, because if you're in the same town, you don't necessarily make a memorandum of every conversation. But at some stage in the 1260s, Urban IV decided he wanted to implement this feast that Juliana had started for the Universal Church. So in 1264, he promulgated the Feast of Corpus Christi, not just for Liège, but for everyone in the church. And alongside that, he promulgated a new liturgical office. And that office of Corpus Christi from 1264 seems to be the one that Thomas Aquinas was asked to compose. So then, tragically, Urban died shortly after promulgating the new feast. So the feast was almost dead on arrival. It only started to be celebrated in some places. But that invitation for Aquinas was really a great turning point in his own life, in terms of his ability to articulate these mysteries of the Eucharist in this poetic liturgical form. So eventually, this feast got re-promulgated in the 14th century, and had been, in the meantime, celebrated in some local regions. But there's really this fascinating direct link between Juliana, Urban, Thomas, and then the spread of all of these chants for Corpus Christi.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think too, what would they have noticed about Aquinas and his work in order to think of coming to him to commission him to do the office?
Yeah, I have a kind of private theory about this that I'd love to find some evidence for, so I put it forward just provisionally. I wonder if Thomas may have actually already written some poetry that we simply don't know that his name is associated with. The Dominicans in the 1240s and 1250s were composing all sorts of new sequences. They were sometimes composing new hymns. And Thomas was in Paris during a lot of this time of creative output. And so I've often wondered, could Thomas have been involved in some of these, as it were, anonymous Dominican compositions? Could he have come to prominence in that way? I don't know that that can be proved or not proved, but certainly not every theologian was able to write poetry. And so I think Thomas must have in some way shown himself to have talents in this regard.
Right. Yeah, it seems unbelievable that they would have just seen a member of the order of preachers writing theological works without any poetic content or intention, and then gone to him. But so let's talk now about these compositions. Can you tell us about the relationship between text and melody in Aquinas's composition? I mean this both in terms of like um, when they're actually set to music, as well as, was he composing his own melodies for the texts?
The earliest manuscript we have for the complete liturgy of Corpus Christi already has musical notation together with the texts. So this is a manuscript. It's now in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, but it seems to have been written in Orvieto in the 1260s, probably as part of this commissioning of the new liturgy. So this seems to be the best authentic source for what Thomas had contributed to Corpus Christi. We don't know exactly, was he working with a team? Did he do everything completely alone? It's not totally clear, but it is clear that from the very beginning, Corpus Christi was a set of melodies and texts that had an integrity together. So I think it's fair to see Thomas not only as a poet, but as a composer, as one who is thinking musically and using music as part of his way of conveying meaning. So in none of the melodies for Corpus Christi are entirely new. I think we, as modern people, when we think of a composer, we tend to think of somebody who's coming up with a totally new melody from scratch. A lot of composition in the Middle Ages, however, was a creative adaptation of earlier music. So one important term is contrafacta or contrafactum. This was a practice of taking an earlier melody and an earlier chant and making a new chant that's in some sense flowing out of that earlier one. So all of the music of Corpus Christi is to some degree or another contrafacta of earlier music. But I think that Thomas is deliberately choosing his musical models as part of his way of conveying the completeness of what he's trying to do with each of his chants and hymns.
Right. So let's talk a little bit now about the office for Corpus Christi and focus in on a couple of particular texts. Let's start with the Lauda Sion sequence. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the overall structure of the text because it's quite long? And then I would be really interested just to have your musings about some of your favorite parts.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say with Laudazione is to recognize that it's a contrafactum of an earlier chant, because that's, again, I think essential for understanding what really is going on there. So the model for Laudazione, the ultimate model of it, is a chant called Laudes Crucis. It's a sequence in praise of the Holy Cross, which originated probably in Paris in the early 12th century. It's a chant that Thomas would have sung when he first joined the order. And it goes through a whole structure of praising the cross. First of all, having an exhortation, an exordium, inviting the singer to go into praise of the Holy Cross. And then it goes through a whole series of images from the Old Testament that point us towards the cross, and then a kind of salvation history, and then it ends with a kind of prayer to Jesus himself, asking him to intercede for us. So Thomas is using both the melody and the overall structure of this earlier Laudes Crucis as a model for Laudazione. So Laudazione then also starts with an exordium. It starts by telling Zion, telling the church to praise the Savior. So the first paragraph or first strophe is really an exordium. And then instead of going through salvation, through the models of the Old Testament immediately, it starts by a kind of theological reflection on the Jesus having instituted the Eucharist. So it goes through a description of that, and then some detailed descriptions of the dogmatic elements of the Eucharist, kind of the way in which it is an outward sign of an inward reality that conveys to us something that's both a sign and a reality, this presence of Christ. So that's a very unusual thing compared to the earlier model, but it's an important part of it. And then it goes on to give a series of Old Testament prefigurations. And then it ends kind of like its model with a direct address to Christ. So I think, yeah, that basic structure of inviting us to pray, telling us what we're praying about, showing us how the Old Testament points forward to the Eucharist, and then finally seeing the Eucharist not as a thing, but as a person, as Jesus himself, who's inviting us into communion with him.
Can you share with us a couple of the particular texts of the strophes that you love the most, theologically, perhaps, or even poetically?
Yeah, I think the exordium is, I mean, the whole thing is beautiful. It's hard to choose any one part of it. But the exordium in particular, I love that phrase, quantum potes tantum aude. So as much as you are able, you should dare to do that much. So that's a really beautiful phrase. And everything about Thomas's writing is so powerful and so multi-layered. But I think part of what he's trying to say is that none of us can sufficiently praise the Eucharist. None of us can fully understand it, even. And yet we have to do as much as we're able to do. So this is a great theme of theology that nobody can increase the faith through their brilliance, and nobody can diminish it through their simplicity. That somehow revelation so far transcends us, and yet we have to say something rather than nothing. That's one of Augustine's principles. So we can't explain the mystery of the Trinity, but we want to say something about it. So nothing we can do can suffice, but we want to do something.
It seems a particularly beautiful admonition for the musician too, quantum potest tantum aude. As much as you can do, you ought dare to do.
I think that's true. I mean, and I think an important principle for music and for sacred music in particular is that it has to be related to the reality of the musicians and the reality of the parish, so that we never want to put a CD on during the liturgy, right? Even if objectively speaking, a CD of the Tallis scholars might sound better than what my school is able to do. It's what I'm doing, it's what we're doing that really counts. It has to be this live performance, and we're giving of ourselves when we sing in the liturgy. We're making a offering of ourselves. It's not about ourselves, but we have to do it. Jesus says in the Gospels, give them something yourselves to eat. So we have to do something rather than nothing, and we shouldn't just wait for other people to do things.
Yeah. I also think about in this text the phrase panis angelorum. What does that mean? I mean, do you have some musings you can share about the bread of angels?
Yeah, so that's a theme that shows up in the Old Testament. It's especially talking about the manna as the bread of angels, but then that the Eucharist itself, it's something that we as humans are privileged to receive. So the angels can look on the face of God directly, but they can't actually receive the Eucharist because the Eucharist is a outward sign. It's something that we need outward bodies to receive. But to see that ultimately we're coming to the same reality, that we have this share. All of the outward signs of the Eucharist are really about bringing us to that inward reality of union with Christ. So the angels are accompanying us in this, but in a sense, I mean, they can't be jealous of us. How could they don't need anything that they don't have? But there's such a privilege that they must recognize and praise, that we're able to receive Christ not only in an inward way, but also in this outward way.
Right. And right before that, Ecce Panis Angelorum, which is, one of the most beautiful parts of the sequence, there's that section right before it, nulla rei fit scissura, signi tantum fit fractura, qua nex status nex statura, signati minuitur. Since a simple sign alone suffers change in state or form, the signified remaining one and the same forevermore. It's such a rich exploration of the sacramental sign and the sacramental reality.
Yeah, I think Thomas is drawing here on the notion of a threefold way of understanding the sacraments. So this notion of the outward sign, the inward reality, and the thing that's both the sign and the reality. This theology is rooted in Augustine and his whole notion of a sacrament as an outward sign of a holy thing. But this whole idea was kind of refined during the 12th century in the midst of trying to understand, various problems of Eucharistic theology. So how can we all receive the same reality when we're eating what's clearly different things, or are we somehow damaging Christ by eating him? What happens, say, when the Eucharist is desecrated? That's certainly bad, but ultimately Christ isn't pained by that. It's only the outward sign that can be desecrated. God himself can't be harmed by this. So it was a whole series of debates that led to the 12th century formulation of this threefold layer of res, signum, or sacramentum, and then res et sacramentum. So this abstract language, Thomas is turning into a poetic reality. So he's using quite technical language, but in a way that is helping us to memorize it in a way, to make it our own and make it not just a set of tools, but rather a grammar of our own prayer and our own devotion.
Yeah. Let's move now to the Pange Lingua text. And, for example, I think one of the most beautiful things in the whole of the gradual is the Crux Fidelis tune on Good Friday. And of course, that is also part of this Pange Lingua tradition that Aquinas is writing into. So could you tell us a little bit about that hymn?
Yeah, so with the three hymns of Corpus Christi sung at the office, each of them is modeled on an earlier hymn. So the Pange Lingua, which is probably most known to people today for its last two verses, Tantum ergo and Genitori Genitoque, which we use at the end of benediction. But the Pange Lingua Gloriosi is modeled on an earlier hymn by Venantius Fortunatus, also starting with the words Pange Lingua. And so that hymn is sung during Passiontide, whereas the Corpus Christi one is sort of deliberately referring us to the experience of Christ's passion, but using it as a way of telling us the whole story of salvation history. It starts by invoking the Incarnation and then the Last Supper, and then helping us to see that the Eucharist is a share in the incarnate Lord, both in his passion and in his resurrection. So the outward signs of the Eucharist are uniting us to that paschal mystery of Christ, who's born for us, who dies for us, who's raised for us. So Thomas is wanting us to think of the connection with the Passion of Christ as we sing about the beauty of the Eucharist.
Right. And of course, in the verse about that we sing for benediction, Tantum ergo, there's that phrase, "Prestet fides supplementum sensuum defectui," and it's such a beautiful recognition of the human needs and the reality that is perfectly visible to the eyes of faith and the intellect focused on the contemplation of the truth. I don't know if you have anything particular to say about that verse in that regard.
I would say Thomas is well aware of the paradox of the incarnation, that Christ shows himself to us in his human nature, and that makes him accessible to us, and we can touch him, we can see him, we can hear him speak in our own language. And this makes God very close to us, but it also veils God from us. It gives us the temptation of seeing Jesus as only a man. So there's always going to be a double-edged sword to any kind of external sign of an internal reality, because it's possible for us to just want to stick to the inward or to the outward sign. So you can think about Christ saying to Mary Magdalene, "Do not touch me," or "Do not hold on to me." He's recognizing this temptation we have sometimes to just stay on the level of the outward reality, the outward sign. But the incarnation is undertaken by God particularly so that we can be lifted up to share in his reality. So Jesus becomes one of us so that we can come to share in him. And the Eucharist is one of the primary ways in which he carries out this saving mystery. So we're able to through this outward sign of the Eucharistic bread and wine, we're brought to the fullness of who Christ is. And of course, because he remains present, his real presence in the Eucharist, the outward sign is good in itself, but ultimately it's pointing us beyond itself. In heaven, we won't encounter the Eucharist in the same way. We're going to encounter God face to face. So we need to be able to use the Eucharist as food for the journey, as something that's helping us, not as a permanent thing, but as something that's leading us to God Himself. That's part of the reason I think why Jesus chose something, bread and wine as these outward signs. They eventually decompose, so we can't hold on to them. The presence of God leaves the outward signs when they lose their substantial reality. So if the bread becomes stale, it's really or if it becomes no longer bread in some way, if it corrupts, it's no longer Christ's presence. And I think that reminds us that the Eucharist is leading us forward. It's something that we hold on to and we're fed by, but we have to be able to receive also in this dynamic way.
Yeah. Let's finish now with one of the other hymns, the Sacri Solemniis, which might be a little bit less familiar to our listeners, unless they're singing the office for Corpus Christi, but or maybe they might use this at adoration or something, but it's not usually used in the Mass except as an addition for a need for more music. So could you tell us a little bit about this hymn, what it's about, and highlight some particularly beautiful passages?
Yeah, the Sacri Solemnis, this one has a less obvious source text and hymn for Aquinas, but it also is a contrafactum. So in this case, it's based on an earlier hymn for the Common of Martyrs called Sanctorum Meritis Inclita Gaudia. So that too is very interesting, that it's inviting us to think about the martyrdom of particular men and women as being a share in Christ's passion, Christ's sacrifice. And this, I think, ties us into a really rich tradition of exegesis. If we go back to St. Polycarp, for instance, as he's being martyred, he describes himself as being like a Eucharistic offering. So martyrdom is really a form of Eucharist, a form of thanksgiving and sacrifice. And Ignatius of Antioch is already pointing us to this same reality when he talks about wanting to be ground up by the teeth of the lions, just like the wheat is ground up. So Thomas is, I think, drawing on this very deep resource of martyrdom and Eucharist in this hymn. So I think that's the first thing to say. But that's not obvious from the hymn itself. You have to know the background to really see that part of it. But the hymn itself, it is also focusing in on the institution of the Eucharist and drawing out the sacrificial dimension of it. So Christ instituted thus this very sacrifice is one of the lines in the hymn. Sic sacrificium istud instituit. The final words of it, they return to a theme we talked about earlier, the bread of angels. So panis angelicus fit panis hominum. The bread of angels has become the bread of humans. So it's an amazing thing especially if we think again about the incarnation as being the center of all of this. It's only because Christ has become man that he's able, or that he chooses to institute the Eucharist in this outward way for us. So when we think about Bethlehem, the place where he chooses to be born is the house of bread. So Jesus is really the bread of angels who's become the bread of humans, of men, and he's done this by himself becoming a man, by taking on a human nature that can be a bridge for us to the divine nature.
Yeah. There's such beautiful texts. And And you mentioned that, these are his first poetics that we have. Are there any other things that he wrote after this?
So the one other poem we might say from Aquinas is the Adoro te devote. So that's one where we often sing it. There's some beautiful English translations as well as some Latin versions. So Gerard Manley Hopkins has a beautiful Godhead here in hiding. So many Christians today experience that as a hymn, and it's a very beautiful Eucharistic hymn to be sung. But it seems to have originally been a poem or a kind of private meditation. It was only many centuries later that it was set to music. So the Adoro te devote, I think, is one of Thomas's richest poetic compositions. We don't know exactly when he wrote it or what the circumstances were. One of the earliest lives of Thomas describes it as a prayer that he would say as a devotional prayer during celebrations of the Eucharist. So he probably wrote it at some stage as a devotion for himself, and then it must have been passed down somehow or another. But that's the only other thing we can say with confidence is written by Aquinas.
Yeah. And then what you're saying means it seems to be linked to those things that one often finds in missalettes, the prayer to recite before Mass and prayer of thanksgiving after the Mass. Was this a common thing that friars did, writing prayers for themselves and the people they were preaching to?
I don't know how common it was. I mean, certainly there's lots of devotional prayers from this period. We don't always know the authorship of them. Many new prayers were written but ascribed to older authors like Augustine or Ambrose. Thomas himself wrote some prayers that are not in poetic form but have very rich imagery and very rich structure. They just don't happen to have a regular rhythm like we expect a poem to have. So Thomas seems to have written a number of prayers. There's a famous prayer for study. There's a prayer in the Roman Missal for after receiving the Eucharist, as well as one for preparing for Mass. So Thomas wrote many beautiful prayers, but it's his hymns that have a more clear structure and meter to them.
Right. Thanks for taking us on this tour d'Aquino. And it's beautiful to reflect on Thomas as a saint, and thinking about him, even imagining him writing these things is an inspiring image.
My pleasure. Great to be with you today.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.